My guest at this time is Mike Hammond. He's legislative counsel at Gun Owners of America. He joins me now to discuss the universal background check legislation approved in the House of Representatives this week, although there was a little bit of a twist after what the Democrats thought was the final vote on that issue. But we'll talk about both things and more in the next few minutes. Mike, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as the debate led up to the vote earlier this week, one of the lead sponsors of this bill, a California Democrat named Mike Thompson, said he's a gun owner and would never put his name on any legislation that threatens to take guns away from Americans. He says this just makes sure that every firearm purchase in the U.S. comes with a background check. What's your reaction to the bill?
Yeah, it's interesting. Ted Kennedy was protected by a guy with a gun, too, who ended up getting arrested when he tried to come into the Capitol. The liberal anti-gunners have no problem with guns being used to protect them. It's just everyone else who they think should go unprotected. So, Mike Thompson's a hypocrite, but what else is new?
Well, let's talk about universal background checks. The argument is that every gun purchase should have a background check. What's your rebuttal?
Well, my rebuttal is that it's a piece of legislation which would achieve absolutely nothing. What do you want to do? You want to stop mass shootings? There has not been a major mass shooting since Columbine 20 years ago that has been committed by someone who didn't either pass a background check or else steal his guns. So it wouldn't have stopped a single mass shooting. In addition, the states that have universal background checks, Illinois, Maryland, would you really want their crime record? I mean, their major cities are rivers of blood. So universal background checks have proven to be remarkably repressive efforts to achieve absolutely nothing. One more thing, incidentally, the background checks would be applied to any, quote, transfer of a firearm that didn't fall within one of the exceptions. Now, a transfer of a firearm, if you give a gun to the neighbor to look at for 1 second, that's a transfer of a firearm. So it was a bunch of sort of tricky people who thought they would effectively outlaw guns and claim they were trying to do something else. And the good news is, my guess is that universal background checks died this week for the remainder of the Congress.
Well, you brought up 2 points there that I definitely want to follow up on. Let's start with the one you made a couple minutes ago, and that's that universal background checks are repressive. Explain why.
Well, because if you transfer a gun to any other person for as little as a second and you don't come with an exception, then you are a criminal and can be put in prison for up to a year. So if you sell your gun to your son for $1, you're a criminal. If you give your gun to your stepson, you're a criminal. If you hand your gun to your neighbor to look at and go into the kitchen for a paper towel, you're a criminal. If you go hunting with a friend and hand him your gun and he doesn't have a hunting license or is a veteran with PTSD, you're a criminal. It's essentially an effort to make gun ownership so full of trapdoors that no one wants to own a gun, because every time you handle that gun or hand that gun to someone, you're basically risk going to jail.
So when they say universal background checks, it's not as simple as that. They add a whole lot of other things to it.
Yeah, well, I think it's intentional. I think the effort is to make gun ownership a very, very tricky proposition. And not surprisingly, the left tries to paint it as something innocuous and reasonable and common sense, but there's nothing reasonable or common sense about it. It's just an effort to put points on the board by people who ultimately want to eliminate the private ownership of guns.
Okay, you've also said this legislation accomplishes nothing and probably died this week. So explain why.
Well, there are few benefits of being around this game for 44 years, but one of them is when legislation is alive and when legislation has died. A couple things happened in the House. First of all, in the Senate, we have 51 votes to kill this bill. We have the liberals, in order to pass it, would need 60 votes to overcome a filibuster and would need 67 votes in order to overcome Donald Trump's promised veto. So the House took up the legislation. If it had any chance of overcoming our 51-vote firewall in the Senate, it was going to have to come out of the House with an enormous amount of momentum. That means dozens and dozens of Republicans were going to have to vote for it, and it was going to have to sweep its way into the Senate and to the president's desk. That didn't happen. In fact, there were only 3 Republicans who were not co-sponsors who voted for this legislation. The second thing that happened, in addition to losing all momentum and coming out of the House as a unipartisan hack bill, the second thing that happened is the chairman of the committee, or the ranking minority member of the committee, Congressman Collins, was successful in adding a killer amendment onto it. That is, he added an amendment which would say, okay, if you're an illegal alien, you're not entitled to buy a gun. So if you're an illegal alien and try to buy a gun, this law would now require the gun dealer and the FBI to turn over the name of the illegal alien to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Lo and behold, all the really leftist Democrats in the House who feel that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Division should be abolished are being bombarded by their constituents with questions as to why they voted for this crazy legislation with this killer amendment attached. So not only does it come over the Senate without the votes to pass, as a matter of fact, as a result of the killer amendment, I don't think the Democrats want it to pass.
Do you support the Collins amendment? Do you think that would be a good law?
Well, freestanding, it would be a good law. I don't think it's a fair trade-off for abolishing all private gun transactions, but we were certainly pushing him to add it as a killer amendment to that bill. Incidentally, they tried to do the same to another piece of gun control legislation with language which would allow a battered woman to get a gun in less than 30 days in order to use it to fend off her prospective stalker or batterer. Surprisingly, all the people who claim to speak for battered women all of a sudden were against allowing a woman to defend herself, because I suppose that's just an issue which is of interest to Democrats when it has political utility for them.
A couple of follow-ups here, Mike, in our last couple of minutes. If the transfer language wasn't part of this and it was simply, if you want to formally sell a firearm, you've got to get a background check, or the buyer's got to get a background check. And you mentioned family members and neighbors and that sort of thing. And I guess the argument from those in favor of such legislation would be that, well, you might think you know your neighbor well, but you don't know what's in the background necessarily, and so what can it hurt? What do you say to that?
Well, as my law professor used to say, if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a trolley car. There are all sorts of hypotheticals which just aren't the case with respect to this legislation. But, look at who's in the NICS system. Anywhere from 400,000 to 4 million veterans. No one had any problem with them carrying a full automatic in the streets of Baghdad. As soon as they come back to this country, they have their rights stripped away. A large number of people who are in that system are people who actually probably should be allowed to own firearms and aren't because of technicalities which arise from a general hatred of firearms by the American left. So if I thought the NICS system was worth having, perhaps I would be in favor of strengthening the NICS system. But I don't think ultimately any criminal who wants a firearm is going to walk into a gun dealer and with the impression that he would pass a background check. In fact, most people who walk into gun dealers and fail background checks, their overwhelming response is absolute surprise. There are people like veterans, people who haven't paid traffic tickets, people whose psychiatrists have turned them in, people who had no idea in the world that the convolutions of federal law would prohibit them from purchasing a firearm. The murderers, on the other hand, just get their guns on the street. they certainly wouldn't be stopped from acquiring firearms by any NICS legislation.
Mike, you explained in detail, and this is our last question. You explained in detail why you believe this legislation is dead. If the Democrats were to get something like this through, where do you think they'd go next?
Well, I think the day after, and they've said so, if they pass this the day after, they'd be back with something else. Perhaps it would be a full-scale ban on semi-automatic firearms, which would essentially result in the confiscation of 50 million guns. Perhaps it'd be a system of gun registration, which this sets up the grounds for creating. And so we all know that any state, New York, California, that's ever had, Illinois, that's ever had a system of gun registration, ultimately has banned those guns. And guess what? They had a handy list of addresses to which they could send the SWAT teams.
Mike, we will leave it there for now. I'm sure we'll be back in this discussion at some point fairly soon. Thanks for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg.
Mike Hammond, Legislative Counsel at Gun Owners of America. Find them at gunowners.org. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.